Hey everyone, welcome to the final far and away presentation for the 2020-2021 season. I'm Rob Duart, one of the co-directors for the FSU Facility for Arts Research. If you don't know what FAR is the Facility for Arts Research, and we basically have this mission of engendering and supporting collaboration within the arts. And one of the ways that we've been doing that is through the Far and Away series that we present. In the past, we've done that here in Tallahassee. And of course, this year we're doing it remotely. This is the last of our events for the season. Next season is coming up. We're already in the process of inviting a great lineup of visiting artists. And so you'll have to just keep an eye out and watch our website for more information. In case you don't know about FAR within FSU, it's essentially made up of faculty from the College of Fine Arts. That includes Judy Russian-Knopf, Denise Bookwalter, Marty Fielding, and me, and among other faculty. And while we are looking forward to being back at the actual FAR facility and sharing popcorn, and I don't know why our thing is popcorn and bubbly water. That's like our thing, but eating popcorn, drinking bubbly water, and actually shaking the hands of artists who are coming here. We still have this kind of fun way of having you interact, and that's through the chat. So if you post anything in the chat, we will get it and relay it to our guests for tonight to include in the conversation at the end. So we've been waiting kind of all academic year for this event, which is a conversation between the members of the collective Related Tactics. That's Nate Watson, Michele Carlson, Weston Teruya. And, I meant to, just before we came on, I was totally convinced that I was pronouncing Weston's name correctly. Teruya, we'll find out. And there's actually a great bio, which doesn't include a pronunciation, a great bio for each of them on the Related Tactics website. But I'll give you some kind of threads to follow. If you're interested, of course, you will be interested in the work that you're hearing about today, but I'll kind of give you the threads to follow for some of the other amazing work that they're doing that might not make it into the conversation today. So Nate Watson lives and works in San Francisco as a contemporary artist and designer, and the executive director of the arts nonprofit Public Glass. That's also where he co-founded Light a Spark, which is an arts program that puts together youth in underserved communities in the SF area with professional artist mentors to work in the glass studio. Michele Carlson was born in Seoul, Korea, and lives in DC. She works across disciplines from visual art to writing and publishing. Her critical writings on art and culture have appeared in Art in America, KQED, Hyphen, and Afterimage. She's an associate professor of printmaking at the Corcoran School of the Arts and Design at the George Washington University. Weston Teruya, every name, it's not just Weston, something's going on, is from Honolulu, Hawaii, and lives and works in Oakland, California. In addition to the work that he makes across a variety of media, you can also check out the podcast that he produced and hosted called Unmaking, in which he interviews artists, art administrators, and cultural workers of color to discuss their work and how they situate it in the world. All three of the artists are here with us virtually today to talk about their work together as Related Tactics. And without further ado, Nate Watson, Michele Carlson, and Weston Teruya. Sorry. Here we go. Thank you.
You did great. You did great on the names. Everything's good. Thank you all for having us here tonight. Thanks, of course, to all the folks at FAR for the generous invitation, Rob and Marty for shepherding the technical, logistical bits and pieces to make this conversation happen. I'm Michele Carlson. Weston, Nate, and I, as Rob said, we're a collective of artists. It's good to note from the beginning that we are the kind of collective that makes art together as like one unit. And we're gonna chat tonight about the work that we make, but also kind of our approach and some of the context around our practice. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So please feel free to pop questions, comments into the chat as they come up, and we'll happily field all of them at the end. I think we're going to start off the evening. Weston is going to start us off with a joint land acknowledgement, and then we'll introduce ourselves a little bit individually before we kind of dive into the conversation that we're going to have between the three of us. Weston?
So even as we gather on this virtual platform, we want to acknowledge that we're all physically on occupied native lands. I'm on Hutin, unceded Vishan Ohlone land. Nate is across the bay on Ramaytush Ohlone land, and Michele is out east on Nutkuchpang and Piscataway lands. We make this acknowledgement with recognition that Indigenous people continue to live, create, and mobilize, and that their work stewarding these lands in the face of ongoing colonialism is what allows us to do our work in our communities. So we thank them.
Thanks. So again, I'm Michele. I'm in the kind of DC metro area. I teach at George Washington University in both printmaking and social practice. I'm an artist and a writer. I kind of work across, a multidisciplinary artist. I work across the kind of mediums and disciplines of writing and publishing and studio arts. I moved from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, a year and a half ago to start working at GW. And so I'm new to the East Coast and these things called seasons and something that's coming called cicadas. But maybe we'll get into that later, but I'll let Nate introduce himself.
My name is Nate Watson. I'm the executive director here at Public Glass. I'm a visual artist. I also teach at the California College of Arts. I've been in the Bay Area for about 16 years, originally from Louisville, Kentucky. I left the cicadas behind. Michele can deal with that. She's tough, and it's going to be really exciting. But most of my work happens here in the neighborhood, in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco. I do a lot of work organizing businesses, organizing creative people, leveraging our networks, trying to kind of set things up for the folks that are going to be our leaders coming up. So I'm very much interested in education and visual arts and kind of impact on the ground level. So, Weston.
And I am Weston Teruya. I'm, as Rob had mentioned, I was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, but now live in Oakland, California. And in my individual practice, I primarily work in sculpture, primarily with paper sculptural installations and some multimedia work. And although my background is actually in painting and drawing, and so I came to working sculpturally sort of organically throughout the arc of my work. And in my sort of other professional hat, I'm primarily a grant writer for small and mid-sized, culturally specific and rooted organizations in different communities of color and across disciplines, not just visual art. And so I'm particularly interested in supporting organizations getting the resources that they need to do the work in their communities. Great.
So Nate, Weston, and I met in 2004, which seems so crazy to say, it feels so long ago, when we were all grad students at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco and Oakland, California. And, we formed Related Tactics officially in 2015, after we'd had this very kind of long, close professional and personal informal relationship that spanned, kind of decade-ish. And so I thought we would start off tonight's conversation just by each of us kind of noting why we individually decided to form Related Tactics as this like formal collective body versus working informally as colleagues and peers and friends on projects. Like what was kind of urgent about forming something official?
I guess I can jump in first. For me, I think at the time that we were forming, I was transitioning out of a job that I had with the city of San Francisco that I'd been at for a number of years. And I think there's something about that process of having come from this very established bureaucratic institution and coming out of a context where it felt like I was putting a lot of energy and work into a process that, at different times may or may not have been able to reciprocate that kind of support. And so there was something very appealing about working as a collective together and knowing that whatever I was putting into this process was this mutually beneficial thing that would in turn feed and support me as well. And so I felt like it's very tied into a lot of conversations that feel very relevant at the moment amongst in the dialogue we're having around labor at this time. And I think, at that time, there were also a number of self-organized cultural districts within the city of San Francisco that were mobilizing, particularly in different communities of color. So in the South of Market with the Filipino community, in Bayview with the African-American community. And so I think seeing how those conversations were coming together in these cultural communities, but also sort of seeing that the corresponding conversations in the broader art world didn't necessarily understand or reflect the nuances of those conversations, particularly where they would not necessarily come into conflict, but where they would rub up against each other. So it felt very important to come together, specifically as a collective of artists of color, to foreground those things and to have a space where we would make sure that those things were not being neglected. And I think along those lines, I think as we've worked together over the past handful of years, it's been this real reminder that, even though we identify ourselves as this collective of artists of color, that those kinds of things are not these stable identities that are meant to be essentializing or definitive forever, that they're, in some ways, it's an acting verb, not a noun. It's a statement of purpose of who we want to be in conversation with, create with, in the struggle with. And so I think it's a constant reminder that creating together is this act of reminding us that it's something that we are constantly trying to achieve, not something that is in itself a given.
Yeah, I think, I mean, from the beginning, Michele and Weston have been such a support for me from, our first couple of days in school together, dealing, with kind of coming through an institution that oftentimes doesn't share your perspective, or this whole idea around care, support, coalition building. It's such an important thing. And I think when we formed in 2015, I had already really established myself in the neighborhood, working as executive director of a nonprofit. I'd been asked to really leverage all of my associations, all the things that I could have brought to an organization that really didn't have money. All we had was connections and resources and a community of care. And so I kind of built this over 25 years in craft. And I could see really very clearly the benefit of collaboration. I'd worked on several boards. I'd been on a lot of panels, a lot of juries and things like that. And, it became clear over time that this idea around networks and network building was really critical to having a strong voice and maintaining stability and integrity in rooms and in situations where potentially the forces are pushing back. They're asking you for your ideas and opinions and to be present, but not always there to support. And then the ways that I really leaned on Michele and Weston through school and in the time after, it became really apparent that this was a time where we all needed a little bit extra. And so I think us coming together for me was a continuation of this relationship that I've had with them over a long period of time. And it was personal, it was professional, but I think it just by giving it more structure, I saw a way forward to do a lot more work. And we all share priorities. It's how we prioritize and really put forward our goals and ideas about how we want to leverage what we bring to the table for our communities and mission, kind of moving everything forward.
Yeah, and I think that's probably also useful to kind of point out that, when we were in grad school in the early mid 2000s and, kind of immediately thereafter, we were kind of emerging and building our kind of creative careers in this immediate post-multiculturalist era kind of moment where the backlash to this thing called like identity politics was really authoring our lived experience as artists. And I think that in school, in the moment, we were often kind of asked and taught to embody white supremacy as this way to kind of negotiate these systems of power, right? Because there was this broader cultural fatigue around paradigms of race that were, kind of, excuse me, timer. But yeah, there were these like kind of this cultural fatigue around paradigms of race for, dominant society that was at the time, the strategy to survive that was to accommodate it. And so I think while over the past decade, the three of us have been a part of each other's networks of support within that context, there was this like, in 2015, there was like this discrete kind of intensity and shift around the impact of, the last presidential administration and the kind of post-Obama backlash. And I think the kind of politics and rhetoric of division was like thrust into the light in this way that was disturbing and traumatizing and terrifying. And I and everyone here, but my day job, I work as a professor, a teacher, so I work with a lot of young people, and I know that in that moment, especially, I was really feeling the impact of many artists of color voicing increasing distress around feeling like being an artist of color was a very violent and unsafe space. So it sort of got to this point where it felt like everything we were doing needed to address this cultural landscape, and that doing it alone was just like not an option, that it wasn't something that one person was going to take on. It's not, systemic racism is not something one person created, so one person cannot undo it. And I think around 2015, that became very clear, and that that kind of shifting of power needed us all. And I think in that case, we were also talking so much about this all the time that at one point, I feel like one of us was just like, maybe we should just form a collective and just do this together. But I think also back to Weston and Nate's points earlier too, that we were also being positioned as gatekeepers for communities of color within the art world. Often, like people would come to us and be like, we want to have a show with artists of color. Tell me who all the artists of color are. And, or we were often kind of pulled as representatives, diversity representatives on different juries or panels or conversations. And I think that in those moments too, we also realized that there was an important need for us to have agency in that and be able to make sure that we were also leveraging those situations for the kind of broader movement building that we were interested in, and not just for institutional purposes.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other things that strikes me, thinking about the history and roots of us working together, is the ways that, even though Michelle, now you're on the East Coast, and each of us grew up in different parts of the country, in Louisville, in Seattle, in Honolulu, that it feels like the context of the Bay Area was very key in shaping our decision to work together as a collective, and in the ways that we talk about that. So how, for each of us, how has the Bay impacted how you think about how we approach our work together? the context for it.
Yeah, I can start. I think one of the things, you know, I grew up in Kentucky, and you know, my family has a background in kind of the rural South, and diversity means something very different there. So coming to the Bay Area, I was exposed to all of these new things, and a much broader kind of range of this idea of diversity, but also it's this place of movements, and I was thinking a little bit about, you know, kind of all the people that come together in coastal cities, and how, you know, as we progress, it's this really interesting diversity that can kind of untether us from Western norms, right? And so you get a lot of movements, and you get people coming together and beginning things, you know, from the Black Panthers, and movements like that. So it's I feel like, you know, it's in addition to it kind of being a coming home, or a place where you can grow and mature, you know, it's really kind of set me on a path that I feel is very natural. And, you know, this collective and the way that we formed it is, it helps me kind of ground myself in all perspectives and all ideas, and kind of remove myself from the limitations of where I come from.
I'm a coastal person, and I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and moved from there to the Bay Area, where I lived for 16 years. And I think that when I moved to the Bay Area, it was a little different than when I left it. And I think that when, you know, in the early mid-2000s, the Bay Area had this very robust network of, you know, kind of DIY alternative art spaces and cultural community spaces. And there really was this sense of like, if you build it, they will come. And, you know, whether that's like an art space in someone's garage, or like a group of folks doing something in someone's living room. And I think that spirit is definitely still there, but there was just this very robust network of this spectrum of different kinds of art spaces that were very artist run, or, you know, someone just decided that they wanted to do this and didn't necessarily like have lots of institutional training or receipts for why they should. They just did it. And I do think that there was this kind of spirit of build the art world you want to see. And I know that's like when I was formerly the executive director of Art Practical, which was an arts media publishing organization. And we really embraced that concept. Like, what is the art world we want to see? We are agents of change. Let's do that. Let's not just talk about it. Let's build the world we want to see. And so I do think that as creative people, our job is literally to imagine the world differently. And so it has always kind of made sense to me that this could translate outside of the studio and into the kind of practice of being an artist and a person in the world. So I think this kind of the Bay Area arts community, and, you know, of course, working with Weston and Nate, has this long history of also paralleling different kinds of movement building in this really unique ecosystem. And so that kind of action on the hyper local in order to reflect the broader national politics was something that I really learned by in the time that I spent in the Bay Area. It was very informative for me growing as an artist in that region, that I think then also makes our practice possible now. When I decided to move to the East Coast, there was this sense for a moment of like what does that mean for us? But I think that it's about now, like, you know, still working at the local level, because most of the way we work locally is about also amplifying to kind of broader conversations.
Yeah, it was important, like what you were just saying about the kind of DIY spirit that we were introduced to the Bay through and within, feels so embedded in the idea of the Bay as this kind of like tertiary arts center where there's not as much of a robust commercial gallery scene or any of those things. But there was something, not to over romanticize it, but it feels like there was something liberatory about that, that like, okay, yeah, there's no market here, so we got to build our own resources and networks of support. And that does feel like it really echoes, like Nate was saying, that something like the historic movement building within the Bay, and that the Bay is where ethnic studies was born, where the Third World Liberation Front was born. That movement building between different communities, and that sort of radical tradition feels very infused in the expectations and baseline of how people want communities to work together here in the area. And even just like with the Panthers, as Nate was mentioning, the sense that they had of internationalism and looking to radical movements in Asia. And so there's always that dialogue and inspiration across communities. So it felt very natural that we would have to come together in some way, in the ways that we have.
Absolutely. I think this is, in talking about the Bay Area, it gives a really nice contextual backdrop for kind of how we formed and how we organize, and the environment and ecosystem in which we organize. So I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit more about how we work, kind of individually and as a group. We are a collective, and I know that for me, I come from a tradition of collaborative working in craft and glass. Michele, you're trained as a printmaker. I know that there's a way that print historically has organized information and passed on knowledge. And Weston, you've got a background in community arts and, building murals and organizing, as well as, painting and drawing and things like that. Can you guys maybe talk a little bit about how you organize or evolved your individual practices and how that kind of informs our work together?
Go, Michele.
All right. Well, I always felt like I was more of an individual sports kind of person. So sometimes I am still surprised that I am on a team sport now. But I do think that I have an individual, all three of us have individual practices that we still negotiate actively in kind of parallels, probably not the right word, but in the ecosystem of related tactics, runs kind of alongside the work we do together. In some ways, like I'm a writer and I work on all sorts of different writing projects, and that's a very alone practice. But I do think that my training as a printmaker, even though print is often kind of thought of as a very traditional, it's often very understood through a kind of Western European canon. But printmaking fundamentally, I think, is a team sport. Printmaking engages the atelier system, right? Most printmakers are used to working in studios with other printmakers, other artists, working for and with other artists. And I think that there is a kind of foundation in printmaking's history of disseminating information, knowledge sharing, exchange, that the multiple, right, like spreading information to the masses. So I think there are many, I often talk about printmaking as a very historic collective practice. And I do think that in my individual practice, I often am working in, if I'm not writing, I'm working in kind of 2D drawing, collage, printmaking, print work. And that work for me is often about imagining new worlds. Whereas I think in RT work, I'm more like interested in intervening in the world that we are in now. But I kind of think about those spaces as two sides of a coin. One is kind of sometimes just confronting things that we see, and other is thinking about things differently than we are currently seeing, right? And imagining a world that could be different.
I feel like that idea of imagining a world that could be different is something so embedded in sort of going back to the themes that we keep touching on, like the whole idea of working as a collective together to begin with is so much about pushing back against and working against around the radical individualism of the art world and the ways that we're taught in that way. And I'm always, I feel like I learned so much from the two of you in terms of having such rootedness within specific disciplines and the ways that I feel like I see that manifest in different ways within our projects, not necessarily as like material form, but as like the framework for thinking about how the projects are created. And so for me, it's so much like I enjoy this versus my individual practice in the ways that it's this constant negotiation and like the surprise of negotiation, that like there are things that we come up with that I would never choose to do on my own, but that's part of the interesting dynamic of it. And I think for me, yeah, like I don't have that same kind of like root in discipline because I've kind of jumped around in different modes for a bit. But I have been thinking a lot about having come out of doing community arts for a number of years, and that was prior to going to grad school. And so I felt like when I went to grad school, there was this return to sort of more of a traditional studio-based MFA kind of practice and training. And I feel like all the years since then have been this slow negotiation and navigation of trying to figure out how to resolve those two sides of my background and training, and figuring out what, not necessarily to like make it this hybrid that is like very obvious and evident, or that I don't think we ever necessarily talk about our work as community arts, quote unquote, or in all the robust complications of that. That some of those frameworks are what I feel like it's starting to get resolved in how we think about things, the conversations we have about audiences that I don't get to have in my own practice individually.
Yeah, I think, for me, coming from a traditional kind of glassmaking background, my whole art life has been about collaboration. It's been about communicating and working with people and building teams and building communities so that we kind of break the limits of material by working together, expand potential, things like that. And I think that, when I moved out west and went to graduate school, I felt like that was my moment to break from that tradition. But working collaboratively and working in community is in me. And I found that through struggle and adversity, building bonds, and also just being at ease with myself as an artist, and settling into a life where I'm clear about what I'm doing every day, and then seeing the results of sustained work. I think I redeveloped this comfort and ease with working collaboratively, and this is how I prefer to work. So when we came together in 2015, I was just, I was so relieved, and I felt like I was ready, like I'd gone through this. Okay, I'm going to be on my own. This is going to be how it is, and I recognized that maybe that wasn't exactly how it was supposed to be for me. So I find this to be really productive, and it's, where I think a lot of people seek out community and they look for that group and they look for that critique. I really appreciate that we've got this perspective and critique built into our working process. It's always there, it's ever present. So I think it brings comfort to me and my creative process, knowing that we're asking all of those questions and really challenging each other all the time. And it may not be as easy as working alone, but I think that's consensus building. It's a check and balance. And allows you to work through issues that are complex and complicated more thoughtfully, and considering all the different ways in which what we're doing might be impactful or not impactful enough, or how people might read it or not be able to read it. So again, I love it as an opportunity to see and live beyond myself.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that's a perfect transition to, the idea of being in dialogue and in community with other people and working through complex ideas is a theme that runs through our work, not just as sort of our internal dialogues, but how we've sometimes worked in terms of using curatorial modes in our work at times. So we're going to talk about a couple of projects that sort of help frame this and show some examples. So Rob, if we can bring up image 1. So this was the first project that we did together as a collective. It was called Declarations for the New Year at Southern Exposure in San Francisco. We invited 40 artists, writers, cultural producers, and civic-minded instigators to make short declarations or calls to action for 2016. And next image, image 2. We printed these declarations as prints, map, postcards, and buttons. And there's actually a PDF that we'll be sharing that collects a selection of some of the text posters from that project that you can download and disseminate. And then image 3, one of our more recent projects that we did in, I guess now it's a couple of years ago, now in 2019, was a project called Ready that took place at the Berkeley Art Center. And the installation centered around a set of mobile stations that deploy a collection of artist interventions, tools, and strategies that can be used to interrupt systems of marginalization, exploitation, and erasure, large and small. And along with the elements we contributed, we also invited a group of other artists to create takeaway elements and pieces that invited responses. So that included artists Sita Kurotomi Balmik, Janaki Jagannath, Cici Carpio, Cute Rage Press, which is Ram Han Cifuentes and Ishida Darab, Rebecca Goldschmidt, Vero Mahano, Naima Morgan and Mike Cloud, and Kim Nguyen. Rob, image 4. And the assembled materials range from the poetic to prompts for guerrilla actions, from stickers to feeds, invitations to participate in literary analysis, or the building blocks for temporary gatherings that are all linked through their interest in encouraging agency in challenging everyday moments when we're often caught off guard and isolated from allies. So Michelle, I think you had a question that you wanted to throw out to us around this strategy.
I think I'm gonna add on the strategy too. I do think that often in our projects we employ curatorial strategies, but also takeaways. So in probably like half the projects we do, maybe more, there is some option to essentially take all the work home. We also will, if we were in person with you, we would probably have stacks of prints for you to take home. We have today in the chat, or we'll send them out, there is a PDF where you can download the prints that we would bring in person for you. You can download those and print them on your home computer or share them. And that kind of idea of decentering the gallery or the art institution and sending work out into the world, and then also the amplification of other voices. I think it'd be great to kind of chat a little bit about those two strategies, both the curatorial and the kind of takeaway strategy.
Excellent. The thing that strikes, this may be a slightly roundabout way of talking about it, but I think the idea of decentering, I think, is really critical also in terms of like this idea of if these strategies are about having a multiplicity of voices, I think oftentimes that having a multiplicity of voices is framed as having a conversation between the center and the margins, and this constant recentering of whiteness and as well as a gallery. And that's one of the impacts of white supremacy, that we don't get a chance to talk to one another as people of color from around the edges of the art world, and or build with one another, challenge one another, all of those things. And so one of the things that I've appreciated about the ways that we take this approach is that it allows us to be in creative dialogue with other artists of color across a range of issues, modes of working, that sort of add different challenges and prompts to one another. And there's certainly far more that could be delved into with any of those projects and how we continue to build them over time. But as a framework, I really treasure that it's trying to create a structure that or alternative structure in some ways that we want to see and want to encourage to build and pop up in different areas as well.
Yeah, I really love like in action when we're curating so many artists into an opportunity, and then we're creating a framework or format for all of those voices to be heard, usually all at once, and sometimes across mediums in different formats in different ways, and everyone has their own way of expressing. I think it speaks to that earlier comment or conversation about us being gatekeepers individually. And now that we're working together, we're able to leverage a lot of our network and create these larger moments where you hear and see a lot of work, a lot of conversation, a lot of responses, a lot of words from all people of color. And it's as somebody who, in a lot of situations, although I might have been with other folks, have felt very much alone in my experience, and it's certainly alone and how I feel my voice is understood or can be heard. It really it makes me feel like I'm part of this larger community. And when we've been asked in the past, like, where are these voices? Where are these artists? Where can you find them? The fact that we're always working in that direction to try to put those voices forward and spotlight them. I think we're creating a mechanism or a model, or helping along this model for making it easier. Not making it easier, but we're doing the work, and we're modeling the work that it takes to find and produce and to get these messages out.
I think also there's, people will often ask us, okay, so are you artists or are you curators? And we always say yes, to both or neither. I think we think about curating as an artistic gesture. We're just using the curatorial model as a tool. And I think that in the way that when we got together as a collective and formed some like transformer artist collective situation, that it's like RT projects are about amplifying our voices. So we are always interested in having our voice in relationship to other people too, right? So it's not just about like our voice becoming one solitary like monster voice, but that it's about becoming, we often kind of talk about related tactics also as a platform. So the three of us and our projects also become a platform where we want our collective voice in conversation with a broader collective, right? And that movement building is not successful because, we isolate like one person from the group, but it's about like the amplification of as many voices as possible, which brings all the kind of challenges of working in a collective and working with many voices, but that also is the work of social justice, right? And so I think that there's something really important about like sharing that platform. And I think we also think about it in terms of reciprocity, that a lot of the work that we've been able to do is because folks opened doors for us and taught us strategies and listened to us and were generous with us. And we feel a responsibility to reciprocate that. And we do that with each other, right? We've been reading a lot about, we're talking a lot about Fred Moten's idea of debt and social debt, and thinking about the indebtedness we have to one another, and that debt in a capitalist culture is both constructive and poison and toxic, right? But for us, we're thinking about like that we've hitched our careers to each other. And there is a lot of accountability to that. We have to show up at every meeting. We have to show up because if we step away, the whole thing breaks apart. We work fully on consensus. And we are in like a professional trust fall with each other all the time. And there is something that we've discovered, I think, that, not to speak for everyone, but I know I've discovered that the work we do as a collective is like what you do in the world when we're trying to move all of these kind of like, just like when we're trying to move culture forward or move it in some direction, that like the practice that I get in RT meetings sometimes is the work I do in the classroom. Like it's the work that I do, that the rest of us do kind of in on the ground outside of the art institution.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been a really good conversation about kind of how we work and our collective practice and approach. And now I think we should talk a little bit about the formal themes and how we often employ in our RT project, like formal themes that we employ in our RT projects. We often use text in our work and approach text and language not just as form, but also a material. I'm going to talk a little bit about two projects we created last year that were significant for us, partly because they were immediately responding to the socio-political moment last summer after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Let's go to image 5, please. The Whiteness of Glass was an invitation extended to Related Tactics by Susie Silbert, post-war curator at the Corning Museum of Glass. Susie invited us to write anything we wanted for their annual print publication, the New Glass Review, in response to what felt like a fervor of corporations and institutions rushing to produce solidarity statements in response to the ongoing movement for racial justice, police brutality, and anti-Blackness. Next, image 6. The Whiteness of Glass presented general demographic research we collected, data visualizations, and a co-written essay and statement of solidarity and institutional critique in the form of our 2017 project, No Matter the Intentions. Image 7. This project is called The Future Now, and it was a sprawling site-specific public art project curated by Astria Suparak and commissioned by the University of San Francisco's Thatcher Gallery that went on display in November of last year. We produced 54 posters presented in English, Chinese, and Spanish. Next image, 8. We positioned a set of instructions and meditations that loosely respond to and illuminate facets of Black life in San Francisco in relation to national politics. The posters were hung in 14 participating businesses along the 3rd Street corridor in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco, where I work. And that's an area of the city that's often framed as the last African-American district in the city, but also has a very rich intersectional cultural history formed from labor around the shipyards, and throughout the history, it's been occupied by different folks, from Chinese fishermen to longshoremen, Italians. It was a place where there were a lot of butchers. The old name is Butcher Town. So it's, it was a really interesting kind of complex place to work, but it's also my home. It's where I live. And it's where, we have established networks, which made it kind of an interesting place for our collective land and our collective to work. Given these two examples of our collective employing of language in dramatically different formats, Weston, would you frame a final question about language as form and material?
Sure, yeah. Maybe we can pull up the last slide while we're chatting. So it really strikes me looking at those projects and that, even though they're all text-driven pieces that they work on the spectrum from very declarative pieces to things that have a slightly more poetic approach, even when the overall projects still have a more direct tone. And so I'm curious for each of you, why are you interested in using language and text this way, and how do you want it to operate in the world? And how has that maybe evolved over time for you across the many projects that we've done, even starting from declarations to these ones that we're just looking at?
I can go first. Sure. I just feel like we have so much to talk about that sometimes text as the vehicle is just it's just straightforward. We have things to say, like we put it in the world. But I do think that one of the things that was mirrored to me, in the kind of 2006, say, without getting too specific, let's say the fall, early winter of 2016, the events that took place then, that one of the things I was finding from students was this real, like, why what does it even mean to be an artist when it feels like the world is falling apart? What does it mean to sit in this studio space in this, you know, private art school and paint things, or, you know, print things, or put my hands in clay and, you know, turn a wheel? What is it? What does that mean when it feels like the world is falling apart around us? And I also felt that. I think I felt that too. You know, I understood that position at, you know, just kind of separate from what one might say in the classroom. Like, I definitely felt that too. And I do think that that, you know, that's when we kind of we were in our first year of related tactics, and it really felt like my individual work as an artist who, you know, maybe at that point was also working much more figuratively, and making images, that it did not feel like that was enough, that it felt like my practice needed to do more, and it needed to be extended further. And it always has felt like the text projects we do, that the work cannot be coded, right? That we, I think, can engage in poetics, or we can engage in, you know, complicating language, but that it is the kind of things that we're thinking about they're not effective if we code them and abstract them. And not that acts of abstraction are not crucial in these moments. I think we need the whole spectrum of artistic approach. But for us personally, and for me personally, I felt like we just needed to say the things that we needed to say. And I also think that text power, I think that power and systems of power and systems of oppression are taught to us through language, through text, through, you know, like that pronouns have a lived experience in the world, like capitalization has a lived experience in the world, and that we also have the opportunity to intervene in these systems of power or vehicles of power that feel kind of like latent or normalized. And so I think there's something really important in the use of language in that way, for me at least.
Yeah, I think for me, it's simple. It's about accessibility and impact. I agree with you. There's a lot to say, and my personal practice has been it's been a journey of building up walls, literally, and boundaries and barriers and codes and protection. And I think within our collective and our employing language, I feel free, I feel empowered, and I feel like it's a safer place for me just to be more straightforward. And so for me, it's like breathing truth. And it's been a totally different experience than for me in terms of making. But I think with the support of both you know, Michele and Weston, it's become this really impactful, powerful tool to be used.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that I always like, even when I sort of wrestle with this and try to figure out like how much leeway do we have to get poetic in these gestures or in these projects, I always feel like Nate, you things that you've challenged us with in the past around like, who's this for? Who's the audience? What are we trying to say? Like, are we actually talking to the people we need to talk to? Is always like this reminder at the back of my head, like, all right, let's bring it back in and try to ground it a little bit more. And so I feel like that's this constant, especially within this. But I am really interested in the ways that we've started to like find the breadth of like that spectrum within the work that in like like Michele was saying, it did feel like it was coming out of a very pointed moment where, yeah, like let's put any thought in this and be as direct as possible. And it feels like in the project that we talked about earlier, ready at the Berkeley Art Center that couldn't really see it in those images, but there were text questions posted on the wall that were inspired by a poem by Amiri Baraka, and we invited people to respond to those questions and write something in them, or write responses to them. And then there was a megaphone cart that you can see that people could cart around and declare the things that they wrote or that other people wrote. And then in some of the Future Now posters, some of them do also have some of that poetic language in it as well. And I feel like there's ways that we're testing out and figure out what that range of language is, and that I'm really looking forward to the ways that we continue to toy with that, not toy with that, but like find our agility in working with the words that we want to work with.
I want to just note, I think thinking about those two projects, the Future Now and the Whiteness of Glass, like both of those projects were produced last summer amongst what was like a very traumatizing summer for many of us, well, for all of us for many reasons, but particularly in thinking about the very kind of brutal killing of George Floyd, and then what it meant to kind of watch that, be trapped at home and kind of watching that replay over and over on our social media. And then, the kind of following summer months. And I think several of our projects have actually come, like the Whiteness of Glass we wrote in like didn't we make that in like a week or two? And some of our projects have really come, like this collective is, and I kind of joke about this, but this collective is really this place where we can place our rage and like and our grief and our grievance, and then also like our happiness and our joy, and like we have tons of fun together, we're friends, right? But like it's this space where all those the complexity of being a human in this world can exist. And often the thing that I have found very therapeutic is that this collective space becomes a place for our rage to become material, to become something productive for us, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just like we're upset and that's what it is. And sometimes it becomes material, and that material is something that, like, through the process of developing it into a project, is the way that we as individuals grapple with the experience of what it means to be like bodies in this world. And, particularly given what's happened in the past year, but then also what just happened in Atlanta, right? And which is, I think, the accumulation of a year of xenophobia and anti-Asian American hate, that was like federally mandated or sanctioned, right? That like these spaces are super important in that way. And these projects have become, their residue of those experiences. And like, just seeing those two projects, because we just kind of finished them, just seeing those two projects in the slideshow side by side made me really realize that they're not just art projects, like they really are the residue of our like process of grieving and our process of grappling with what it means to do the work that we want to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that as a very hopeful note to maybe transition to Q&A, like that it is, yeah, it's about that kind of productive work and dialogue together, that we're interested in that transformational process of taking those feelings and moving into something else. So yeah, I think unless there's something else on the phone, we can transition to any questions from the audience that may be there.
Yeah, so we do have a few questions. And one of the first questions that we had was about, and I'll extend it a little bit. It's from one of our grad students, Cheng Song, and she was specifically asking about typography. And so it's interesting, just in talking about the materiality and also talking about kind of language as a really direct way of communicating. Also, someone else mentioned how they appreciate the use of multiple languages. Just as an aside, I thought it was interesting, just kind of this sort of strength in numbers that you have, in the collaborative, and then also that you kind of extend those numbers to include the audience, and then having this kind of extra layer of accessibility that everyone becomes a part of it. It's really kind of amazing. But then just thinking about typography, color, these formal decisions, I'm curious about the ones that were in the gallery. They sort of look like they're referencing maybe some specific posters, but then the ones that match the colors of your backgrounds right now have some other significance. So maybe you can talk about those decisions.
I guess maybe a quick sort of credit that the posters for declarations were designed by a friend, Shanta Marabuchi, who is a graphic designer and web designer. And so she sort of was inspired by seeing the set of text and drawing on the language of like sheets of design instructions, sort of like governmental signage, and claiming that as a design template to make frame and put out these declarations. I guess do either of you want to tackle the typography, or should I just ramble a little bit? I guess it's maybe, especially in relation to the last discussion we had, in some ways that is where some of that maybe more intuitive side of things and abstract side of things comes into play, that we don't necessarily sit there and like map out the typography as much as see what feels right in the moment and show each other options and play with that a bit. The palette for the future now was drawn from what Nate had suggested to us around the colors of the neighborhood, particularly the colors of like bougainvillea, because there was a very prominent wall on one of the storefronts that had this cascading set of bougainvillea vines. And so I think there's things like that are references to very specific moments within spaces, or sort of things from the built landscape, as well as things that are more gestural and intuitive that come up just through the design process and passing images back and forth to one another.
Sorry, I knew there had to be some technical problem. I was muted. We're out of Zoom, and still we have you're muted problem. Another thing that someone had asked is how the distance affects the work that you're doing, either in how it materializes or how the ideas shift. You're kind of working across the country.
I guess I'll answer that as the one who moved away. Although I feel like we just recently talked about changing the narrative to being Nate and Weston are the ones who stayed. But no, I think, it's funny because it feels like there would be a big impact, but actually the three of us really worked very remotely before, when we were all in the same kind of geographic region, just because of schedules. And if you have ever been to the Bay Area or lived there, like popping across the Bay is not always just like a speedy situation. So we often met virtually, and I will say that we have produced more than one project via text message, essentially. So we have a very robust multi-platform remote kind of practice. I do actually think that this is the first time where, and I think this is actually not because of the remote aspect, or the remote aspect is compounded by COVID travel restrictions, that this is the first time I think we've produced in the past, handful of months, 3 projects that I haven't seen in person. So we're definitely venturing into this world where we're producing work and I haven't even seen my own artwork. And sometimes that's fine because some of the work we produce, the digital aspect is, it's fine. And at least one of us is engaging the, the physical kind of production. But that has definitely, for me at least, been, it's a growing frustration, but that's compounded just by, I haven't seen art in person in a year. And I think that it's deeply impacting my just lived experience in the world. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about, that it's, my whole world is based around seeing artwork, even my students, which I have just been seeing virtually. So I think there's a lot of things at play that are actually outside of the collective itself. But
yeah, I think it's such an interesting way it's to work. I think in the past, the way that I've worked with materials or generated work was in a reactive way. I would make something, I would spend time with it. I'd think about it. I'd do something different. I'd spend time with it. And now I think the way that we come up with things is like we're front loading all of the questions, all of the dialogue, all of the context. And it's really, we're building these things through conversation and then distilling the conversation and isolating what's really interesting about these issues and our ideas and our opinions, and then kind of looking at the concept of what we're talking about within a context or a space, and then talking 360 degrees around that, and then using our imaginations, and then drawing and doing mock-ups. And we're working on something in Berkeley right now, and Weston went on a walk and sent us back a PowerPoint of all these different like sceneries and empty lots and fences, and we're just trying to put ourselves there. So it's just, I never in my wildest dreams imagined that I would work this way or work this way collectively. But it's just, I think it's given me a clarity or a perspective that I never would have found on my own or found without the added, like we said, the added challenge of not being able to travel, because we would have always tried to bridge these gaps by being there, by being on the ground. And I think that there'll be a lot of value to getting back to something like that. But I think that we've developed a sensibility or a making muscle, by working, by being challenged this way. I think we'll have more when we're able to have all the things that we had before, plus this new way of working.
Yeah, it feels like it's challenged us to have to think very deliberately about meeting for the time that we spend together. And part of it is because we're more busy now than when we first started, but it does feel like our meetings have to be very focused and considered, and that they're, and when we have had a small moment where everyone's in town and can actually like be in the studios together, that those things are precious. And as we try to map out things for next year and speculate what will happen, that those things are very like, okay, we have to carve that out, and that's going to be like hardcore collective time where we finally get to do work together. And so each of we meet like twice a week, and all of those feel very considered because things are remote in a very different way than when we were all in town and still working and meeting like this. But the texture of it feels different because the stakes feel higher.
Sorry, I was muted again. I actually have a lot more questions, but maybe a good closing question from someone else, from Maria in the chat, is just asking what's next. What specifically with the collaborative, what project are you working on now?
Yeah. Nate, you want to talk about disclosure?
Sure. We've expanded on the Whiteness of Glass writing that we did for the new Glass review, and turned that into kind of a multi-phase project where we've created a model for how we're looking kind of at the demographics of the Glass community, And we're looking at that institution kind of born out of factories and brought to the United States from kind of a Venetian sort of historical framework. And we're taking kind of easily found demographics, translating those into data visualizations, translating those into writing instructions, and then delivering those to a group of artists of color to actually make work, and creating a residue that is the evidence of us rebuilding networks that were never allowed to exist before. And not to say that they don't exist. We're just kind of referencing back and looking at all of the boundaries, all the barriers to entry of kind of this craft medium specifically, being material specific, heavy utilities, expensive, hard to enter, not at a lot of institutions. The places where you would generally go to learn and advance and move through these things are expensive to participate in. And so we're just kind of looking at that historical framework and looking at the opportunities and the amount of diversity that those barriers have prohibited. And we're trying to help along this building of networks so that when students and folks are introduced to this for the first time, that they are able to find community more easily. They have a way to enter, they have mentors, they have people that they can look to and talk to. And we're just trying to, again, spotlight and create a model for potentially directing this in different other spaces. So that's one project.
Well, it's probably good to note also, just because they have been difficult to read in the images, that the demographics for the Whiteness of Glass look at things like, there are like 2 tenured glass faculty that would identify as Black in the country, right? In every glass department, every university, right? And we, like, those demographics look at leadership positions. So also looking at leadership within craft and glass museums and spaces, right? And really thinking about like what are the demographics, and then using that information to create, for us as related tactics, to create these data visualizations that then a second tier of artists of color will kind of manipulate into instructions that then another group of POC BIPOC glass artists will then work together in the studio to create objects from. So it's like this iterative collaboration that, as Nate, talked about, is it really also not only about like collaborating with all these awesome artists, but about building these networks for these communities that are very, very, very isolated. So I think we have on our website those demographics you can see a little bit more close up. So it's like those statistics are important in the framework of what we're trying to do.
And then the other project is the one that Nate mentioned briefly around that is taking place in Berkeley, California. We have a residency with Kala Art Institute, which is an amazing print and media organization along a corridor called the San Pablo Corridor. And they have a residency program that's focused on called Print Public, and invite artists to do works in the public sphere, responding to things going on the corridor there. And so we're in the early stages of doing research and looking at sites and thinking about the history of the space. And we'll be, over the next year, we'll be doing some interventions and pop-ups and different projects along the corridor in public space. So we're also excited about that. I think this would be a good year in terms of like projects that are about kind of field building and gathering of people, and other projects that are a little bit more of a direct response that we're shaping as a group together.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm totally muted. I was totally muted for that whole thing. Luckily, I figured out today how to record in multi-channels, so you'll have to listen to the playback to hear that. I'm not going to repeat it. It was too good. Okay, so I will you'll have to play back the stream and you'll catch that. But it's perfect timing because I can say thank you to Weston, Nate, and Michele, and thank you to everybody in the chat. I'll go back to the three of you so you can say bye and make sure we have the right URL for related tactics, and then I'll just come back and kind of tell everyone how we're able to do this this series.
Thank you so much, everyone, for, I know hopping onto more Zoom calls or, live streams is such a burden. So thanks for sharing your time with us. And our website is relatedtactics.com. Our handle on Instagram is relatedtactics. So you can find us there, and don't hesitate to reach out and say hi.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for your time.
The website for FAR is artsresearch.fsu.edu. Thank you again to Weston, Nate, and Michele, and thank you to everybody in the chat. We can do this series because of support from the College of Fine Arts, so thank you to the College of Fine Arts. Take care, and we will hopefully see you in person soon. Watch for our updates on who's going to be a part of the next Far and Away series. Thanks, everybody.